Hi everyone, my name is Brianna Wisner, and I study the effects of early literacy interventions on students with dyslexia. My interest in dyslexia came from my personal experience in servicing, or rather disservicing, my students with dyslexia. As a second-year, second-grade teacher, I encountered two students who struggled in reading despite the many interventions they were receiving, such as daily Title I services, leveled literacy instruction, daily foundations instruction since kindergarten, and weekly after-school tutoring sessions. I saw these students making minimal progress despite every attempt I made to intervene. The following year, in third grade, these students were both diagnosed with dyslexia and were put on individualized education plans. Their IEPs called for more intense phonics instruction through Wilson Works with a certified Wilson's teacher. After about a year of these interventions, my former students began making significant literacy gains. After feeling as though I had failed to give these students what they needed, I began to realize that their preschool, kindergarten, and first grade teachers had also failed them by not recognizing the early signs of dyslexia and not knowing how to properly assist these students. The study of dyslexia is important because there is a lack of understanding and not much training given to teachers. There are many common misconceptions, and the signs of dyslexia and determining effective interventions are not well known. Washburn, Binks, Cantrell, and Joshi 2013 cited Eden and Moats in 2002, stating that approximately 5 to 10% of individuals have a specific learning disability, often referred to as developmental dyslexia or more commonly as dyslexia. Allington in 1978 wrote, "We should disregard the notion of perceptual deficits. Reading disabled children make errors, but not because they cannot discriminate letters." Washburn, Binks, Cantrell, and Joshi in 2013 surveyed 101 pre-service teachers in the US and the UK and found similar findings that dyslexia was still being misunderstood as a visual perception deficit. The research on dyslexia first began in the late 1800s. Early researchers included Adolf Kussmaul, Rudolf Berlin, W. Pringle Morgan, James Hinshelwood, and Samuel T. Orton. Kussmaul in 1878 was the first researcher to use the term word blindness. It was not until 1887 that German ophthalmologist Rudolf Berlin used the term dyslexia, meaning difficulty with words. Pringle Morgan reported the first case of dyslexia in the British Medical Journal in 1896. Pringle Morgan and Hinshelwood both described dyslexia as congenital word blindness caused by visual processing deficiencies. Dr. Samuel T. Orton in 1925 developed strategies based on his belief that dyslexia affected one hemisphere of the brain. Many of Orton's strategies he developed in 1925 are still used today. Dr. Pringle Morgan in 1896 studied a 14-year-old boy with word blindness and found that the student had difficulty in spelling even basic sight words. He had great difficulty in writing dictated sentences, and he could not read multisyllabic words. Morgan believed that this was a result of left hemisphere deficits, but he noted otherwise average to above average intelligence in the student. In 1911, Dr. Hinshelwood studied siblings with an aunt who was word blind because he believed dyslexia to be hereditary, congenital, and affecting the left hemisphere, just like Pringle Morgan had. He began by studying a 12-year-old female who was the niece of the individual who was described as word blind and also had a brother who was word blind. The 12-year-old female student knew her letters and basic sight words, but in 7 years of schooling had made little reading progress. Hinshelwood described her as very bright in math. He also studied her 10-year-old brother, and he did not know any letters, any words, or numbers in print, but Hinshelwood said that both students had strong auditory memory. After studying these students, he believed dyslexia fell along a spectrum. He described the female student as having a more mild case of dyslexia and her brother having a more severe case. Dr. Orton in 1925, like Pringle Morgan and Hinshelwood, believed that dyslexia was hereditary, not associated with intelligence, and affecting the left hemisphere of the brain. He wanted dyslexia to be described as a disability rather than as students with dyslexia being described as defective. He rejected Hinshelwood's term word blind and created his own term, strephosymbolia, which is a combination of Greek words meaning twist and symbol, since he believed that letter reversals and the inability to make meaning of symbols was what caused dyslexia. There were many interventions that he used that are still around today and still proven to be effective. He used blocks to segment syllables. He believed in directly teaching phonetic rules and how to segment syllables. He believed in the importance of early interventions, but he disapproved of sight word methods, or what he called the look and say model, because he felt this did not allow students adequate time to process the words. He believed that the best interventions were provided by knowledgeable patient teachers, because impatient teachers often damaged the emotional well-being of students with dyslexia and made them feel as though they were unintelligent and incapable of learning to read. He thought that strategies needed to be done in a thorough, repetitive drill routine, and that students with dyslexia would make their own adjustments so that they could learn to read. My research question was, how do early interventions affect literacy outcomes for students with dyslexia? Dyslexia was coined in 1887 by Dr. Rudolf Berlin, and it is composed of two Greek words meaning faculty or impaired and legion or to speak. So in other words, that it is a speech impairment. Dyslexia is a congenital disorder, and this was confirmed by Gray in 2008 and consistent with the early research findings of Pringle Morgan in 1896, Hinshelwood in 1911, and Orton in 1925. The most common misconception is that dyslexia involves letter reversals or reading words and numbers out of order. Gray in 2008 found that this was common and a non-indicator of dyslexia. Unlike the early findings of Hinshelwood, Gray believed dyslexia is a processing disorder, not a visual disorder. Snolling and Melby-Lervag said that a phonological processing deficit can be conceptualized as an endophenotype of dyslexia. This proves the genetic connection that Gray described and early researchers predicted. Gray said that dyslexia affects 1.5% to 5% of the population and is not determined by gender, but Snolling and Melby-Lervag found that it affects 3 to 7% of the English-speaking population, with more boys than girls being affected. Although certain characteristics of dyslexia can be debated, it is clear that dyslexia can be defined as a congenital disorder that is often hereditary and affects an individual's inability to interpret letters, words, and symbols, which ultimately hinders their reading development but is mutually exclusive from their general intelligence. Since dyslexia ultimately affects students' ability to develop as readers, it is important to notice signs of dyslexia early on so that interventions can be put in place at an early age. You may notice that students with dyslexia have extreme difficulty spelling even monosyllabic words. They struggle to blend or segment phonemes and syllables because dyslexia is a phonological processing disorder. They have difficulty decoding words, even basic CVC words. They're unable to notice or create rhyming words potentially. There is a family component or hereditary component that should be considered, as family history does often predict reading difficulties. Snolling and Melby-Lervag found that the likelihood of reading difficulties, however, is significantly increased in children at family risk with offspring in such families veering along a continuum of severity, which was consistent with Hinshelwood's research in 1911. In students with dyslexia, you will notice phonological processing delays or deficits. And you may also, especially in kindergarten and first grade students, notice letter naming abilities. Snolling and Melby-Lervag found that even if children are at family risk of dyslexia, if they develop early letter naming abilities, their risk of developing a reading disability dramatically decreases. Children use phonological awareness to speak before they begin to read. If speech is delayed, it may be an early sign of future reading difficulty. Kovelman and the researchers used auditory word rhyming tasks in typical children and in those with dyslexia between the ages of 5 to 13 and found that typical developing children use the left hemisphere of their brain to complete auditory tasks, but Children with dyslexia did not. It is important to develop language and vocabulary skills in students with dyslexia, as researchers have found that language has a direct effect on students' ability to make sense of literacy. Gray and Kovelman, their research confirms that interventions should occur before third grade, as the rhyming effect is developed as early as age 7. The left hemisphere activation increases with reading development, but it is reduced for children with dyslexia. In other words, children with dyslexia tend to rely on the right side of their brain when reading, but children with typical development use more of the left hemisphere, and this increases as they continue to develop as readers, but it is reduced in students with dyslexia. Lim and Owie discovered an inverse relationship between students' initial age beginning Orton-Gillingham intervention and improvement made during Orton-Gillingham intervention, which proves the importance of beginning early. The best research-based interventions are going to be multisensory, phonetic, and phonological. Since dyslexia is a phonological disorder that affects mainly the left hemisphere of the brain, any kind of multisensory activity that activates both hemispheres of the brain and teaches students to use them simultaneously and to strengthen that left hemisphere are going to be the most effective. The Orton-Gillingham approach is a research-based intervention that has proven to be beneficial for students with dyslexia. Any interventions that you conduct should connect visuals to the spoken word. Snolling and Melby-Lervag and Alt and researchers found that spoken word learning deficits are typical in children with dyslexia and that processing is often lost between the visual spatial and the phonological demand, or when they're transferring information from the right to the left hemisphere of the brain. It is beneficial for students to learn letter sounds before having them memorize letter names so that they associate symbols with sounds and not just names. Rhythmic training to improve phonological awareness may also be beneficial. Thompson, Leong, and Goswami wanted to develop an intervention for students that maybe rejected or did not respond well to the basic phonics intervention, and so they had students actually copying rhythms and mimicking sounds in order to develop their phonological awareness. The important stakeholders are students with dyslexia, parents and families, and of course, educators. Educators need to know that dyslexia is congenital, meaning students are born dyslexic, and it is often hereditary. Preschool and kindergarten teachers have the greatest responsibility in regards to recognizing the early signs. They should pay close attention to students who are unable to name letters or letter sounds, who struggle with rhyming, and who have great difficulty recalling sight words at the end of kindergarten. Difficulty segmenting syllables, segmenting or blending phonemes, and great difficulty spelling are also early indicators of dyslexia. Educators should consider the family history and the literate home environment when determining if a student may be dyslexic. It's very important to remember that letter reversals or reading words or letters out of order is not a sign of dyslexia in developing readers. Dyslexia cannot be cured, but there are effective interventions that can help students overcome the disorder. The earlier interventions begin, the better. The most effective interventions are early, intense, frequent phonological, and multisensory interventions. And if you have a student with dyslexia, I would consider Orton-Gillingham approach. For potential research in the future, I would like to follow students from kindergarten through 12th grade to determine the effects of early interventions. I would use intense phonological interventions since kindergarten and compare these to phonological interventions beginning in 4th grade for typical and dyslexic students. My research question would be to determine how do early phonological interventions affect the long-term literacy achievements of students with dyslexia. Ultimately, I want to spread awareness. I want to share my findings with teachers, administrators, and parents, to educate stakeholders on what dyslexia is and is not, and to explain how to detect the early signs. I would like to provide training on conducting effective interventions and to determine new interventions based on my research.